It's time, so let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the GRIPS webinar. I'm Narushige Michita. I teach International Security Affairs at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. We call it GRIPS. GRIPS is a good name for a school because it means brain in German. And when I said this, my friend raised his hand and said grips in French means influenza. So we stick to German. Anyway, this is a graduate school only school based in Tokyo. The world is changing and the big power shift is taking place in the Indo-Pacific region. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, in the past 10 years, the US defense expenditure declined by 15%. And Japan's defense expenditure increased, but by only 2%. China's defense spending increased by 85% in the same period. When one considers the long-term trends, it might become difficult for the United States and Japan to keep competing with China on military capabilities. To discuss this important challenge, we have invited Dr. Toshi Yoshihara today. Dr. Yoshihara is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, CSBA. Before joining CSBA, Dr. Yoshihara taught strategy at the US Naval War College for over a decade. He was also an affiliate member of the China Maritime Studies Institute at the War College. He holds a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, a master's degree from the School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University, and a bachelor's degree from the School of Foreign Service of the Georgetown University. Dr. Yoshihara, welcome to the GRIPS webinar.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Michi. It's a real pleasure.
Last time we invited you, we talked about your co-authored book entitled Red Star Over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to US Maritime Strategy. And actually, there is a Japanese version of this book under the title of Taiheiyo no Akai Hoshi. So if any of the viewers have not acquired this, purchased this book in Japanese or English, go ahead and buy one, I hope. So at that time, you were still with Naval War College. And so when did you move to Washington? You know, CSBA is based in Washington, right? So when did you move to Washington, D.C., and how are you enjoying your life there?
Yeah, so as you mentioned in my bio, I was at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island for about a decade. And I moved to Washington about 3 years ago. And what's been fun about this is that, you know, it's actually a return to Washington. Washington, D.C. has a special place in my heart because it was my first city here in the United States. I moved here in 1993 when I went to Georgetown. And so Washington was my first home here. I lived in the Washington area for about 5 years before moving on to pursue other career interests. So you know, when I moved 3 years ago, it felt somewhat like coming back home. My wife actually grew up in the Northern Virginia area, very close to Washington. She also went to the Naval Academy, you know, close by in Annapolis, Maryland. She also was stationed when she was a naval officer in Norfolk, which is of course close to Washington as well. And then in the mid-90s, she was a White House fellow. So she also knows Washington very well. And both of us feel very much at home here. So in some ways, it's nice to be back.
Right. How do you compare the life in Newport, where the Naval War College stands, and life in Washington? You know, certainly there must be an upside and downside.
Yes, well, it's, I mean, it is, they're two very different places. As you know, you've been to the Naval War College many times, that you know that it's a historic a port, a historic seaport. I think based on some measures, I think it has the largest numbers of colonial era or pre-American Revolution homes per capita across the country. So it's a deeply historic town. Obviously, close ties to America's naval and maritime history. The Naval War College itself has a beautiful campus right next to the water. It's a historic school. It's the oldest school for senior military officers engaged in graduate studies in the country. And so, I had an office that overlooked the Narragansett Bay. Something that I certainly can't say for my new office here in Washington. So, in certain ways, the quality of life was very high in Newport. But on the other hand, as you know,
it's a beautiful place. Beautiful.
It really is beautiful.
It's amazing view.
But as you know, it's hard to get to and it's hard to get out of. And
right.
If you're doing Asian research or if you're just generally traveling a lot, it's a really inconvenient place. So there are definitely trade-offs in living in Newport. The one downside that I've learned is here in Washington is the traffic. It got a lot worse over the 20 years that when I left in the late 90s, Washington was just taking off as a major international city. And when I came back, I was just stunned about just how many things have changed, the buildup of the city, the growth of the city. And then, as I said, the traffic is just atrocious. So definitely big trade-offs between the two cities.
Right. That's interesting. Okay, so today we would like to talk about your new report, whose title is Dragon Against the Sun, Chinese Views of Japanese Seapower. And let me try to share the, so here, this is the report. And so when did it come out?
So the report was published in mid-May, so it's
very new,
fairly recent report.
Right. Okay. So we'll be talking about this report today. So first of all, what motivated you to write this report? This is an interesting title. How did you come up with the title?
Well, so the title of the book is in reference to a classic study of the Pacific War between the United States and Imperial Japan. The original title by Ron Spector was Eagle Against the Sun, which detailed, of course, the competition and the naval war during the Pacific War between Imperial Japan and the United States. And, as I was trying to think up of ideas for the title of my report, it occurred to me that Japan, faced problems when it dealt with American naval power, and it faced many of the similar dilemmas and problems that Japan faces today, and primarily it's the material asymmetry between Japan and the United States then, and the material asymmetry between Japan and China today. And so I thought that it was useful to use that classic study as a way to frame basically the broad thrust of this report.
That's interesting. So what did you say? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So you were asking too earlier about what motivated me to write the report.
When did it come to your mind?
Well, I was always very interested in looking at the balance between China and Japan, particularly in the maritime domain. So about 10 years ago, I began writing about, the need for Japan to think about adopting an anti-access strategy, which was in some ways to borrow from China's playbook, to borrow from China's script, and to use anti-access in order to turn the tables around China. And the premise of that argument was that I had already discerned, about 10 years ago, that the conventional military balance was already shifting in some ways quite radically in favor of China. And that therefore Japan needed to adopt asymmetric responses that leveraged its geographical advantages to impose cost on China should deterrence fail. And And so the premise of that analysis, though, was that the military balance was already shifting. And in the intervening years, what I thought was interesting was that even as the balance shifted even more in China's favor, very little was being discussed in any serious way in either Washington or in Tokyo about this phenomenon. And I understood from my reading of history that when major naval balances shift in a particular direction, when there are severe imbalances, that has historically been a precursor to intense great power competition and even great power wars. And yet no one seemed to be, kind of ringing the alarm bell saying, hey, everyone, let's start paying attention to this really important phenomenon. And so I thought that it would be useful to raise public awareness and policy and awareness among policymakers, both in Washington and Tokyo, about the shift, because I think this shift will have implications not only for broader regional security, but also for, I think, the health of the Japan-US alliance. Right.
And I was intrigued by the fact that you used the term asymmetric response when you talked about Japan, because when we talk about asymmetric response, that's a weak powers response to great powers, right? So it's kind of we have come a long way when we are talking about Japan as a weak power, right? So it's kind of interesting new phenomenon that's taking place.
That's right.
What did you say in your report? What are the main arguments of your study?
Yeah, so basically, I make the case that firstly, that China was very rapidly eclipsing Japan in terms of naval power, and that China's displacement of Japan as a leading regional sea power in Asia was going to introduce more dangers and instability in the region, and could potentially stress the US-Japan alliance. And I make this case because I believe that the shift in the naval balance will firstly intensify the ongoing Sino-Japanese naval rivalry that's been taking place for at least a decade, and that more worrisome, because of this rapid shift in the naval balance, it will confer to Chinese leaders and Chinese military commanders more options than they've had before, and that might convince the CCP and the PLA, the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, to potentially pursue an offensive strategy should deterrence fail. And so because Japan is such a critical stakeholder in maintaining this current maritime order, the US-led liberal international order, Japan and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force play such an indispensable role in upholding that order, that the relative decline of Japanese naval power vis-a-vis China, I think could have implications both for regional security, for deterrence, for allied warfighting, and again, for the integrity of the US-Japan alliance.
Okay, also, and thank you very much. And by the way, for the viewers, I have shared a link to the report in the chat box. So if the viewers who have not gotten hold of this report, please open the chat box and you can find the link there and you can download while you are listening to this discussion. So that's the big picture you've drawn, and so you've provide an assessment of the shifting Sino-Japanese naval balance. Certainly it's shifting in favor of China against Japan, unfortunately. But what are the main trends in the balance that you see?
Yeah, so what I try to do is to identify sort of rough proxies or useful proxies that allows us to meaningfully compare naval prowess between China and Japan. The most obvious metric, of course, is fleet size. Just how many, how many ships and submarines each side has. If you simply compare the fleet size, it's clear that China is has already raced past Japan and is racing further ahead. By most recent estimates, China already has the largest navy in the world, with more than 300 ships and submarines. And it expected that by the end of the next decade, I mean, by the end of this decade, by 2030, we could be seeing a Chinese Navy that is substantially larger than that, you know, over 400 ships and submarines, perhaps even, you know, more than that. And so that's of course coming against the backdrop of Japan expecting to have a relatively stable size in terms of fleet size. And so if you just simply look at the numbers, it's, you know, it's in some ways quite depressing.
So in terms of ratio, what does it look like? I mean, is it 3-to-1, 4-to-1?
Well, so it depends on the you know, the what ships you include and what ships you exclude. But in terms of sort of the main battle force, I would say it's close to a 3-to-1 or even a 4-to-1 ratio. Yeah, and so it's a, you know, I mean, it's a big jump, a leap in fleet size. And of course, what was troubling to me too, you know, to go back to this idea that no one was talking about the Sino-Japanese naval balance, was that everyone else, when China emerged as the largest navy, everyone was talking about how it surpassed the United States in terms of fleet size. And I think that debate, in some ways, sucked up a lot of the oxygen, and I think then therefore overshadowed, I think, you know, what I think is an equally important power shift in terms of China surpassing the Japanese maritime service. Now, there are also other, you know, important measures like aggregate tonnage. So, you know, because tonnage gives you a sense of the capacity and the capabilities, right? Because, you know, tonnage gives you a sense of what kinds of, you know, sensors, weapon systems, capabilities that could be carried by ships. Now, it's a very rough measure because aggregate tonnage doesn't really tell you very much. And so, you know, you kind of have to dig a little deeper into looking at, say, tonnage, average tonnage per combatant. So, you know, what's the average size of any given ship within the fleet? And in this category, actually, you know, Japan still enjoys a comfortable lead.
Oh, okay. Good news.
The problem, of course, is that as China begins to introduce more carriers, which it has, and as it engages in serial production of its cruiser, which is going to be the largest cruiser in production in the world, and its ongoing serial production of advanced destroyers that also are you know, heavy in terms of tonnage. You're going to see that balance shift in China's favor as well.
Right. So is the Chinese cruiser bigger than Kirov, Soviet Kirov?
I don't know, but I do know that you know, if you compare it against say the DDG 1000, the Zumwalt class, I think the Zumwalt class is still technically larger. But the problem, of course, is that the U.S. Navy has capped the Zumwalt at 3, doesn't plan to make any more. Whereas in the Chinese case, they're engaging in the serial production of these ships, and you know, we could expect, you know, perhaps over a dozen of these things entering the fleet. So you know, so that I think gives you a sense of, again, the capacity and the capability of the ships that the Chinese are going to sort of put to sea in the coming years. And then finally, the last metric that I used is firepower, which I think is also a useful way of thinking about, you know, the degree of lethality of the fleet. And one way of doing it, and it's not a perfect way, is to assess the vertical launch system, which are basically these groupings of missile cells that holds various types of munitions, anti-ship missiles, land attack cruise missiles, ballistic missile defense missiles in the case of Japan, and so forth. So I use that, the number of cells in the vertical launch system in each fleet as a way to make that comparison. And as you can see from the graph that is coming on, you can see that China rapidly caught up. You know, the first point here is that Japan introduced the VLS system about a decade earlier than China. But by the mid-2010s, China basically caught up and then surpassed Japan. And now Chinese VLS cells have now accelerated well past Japan. And based on our latest estimates in 2020, it appears that the Chinese Navy had about 75% more cells, more VLS cells than the Japanese fleet, and that gap is actually likely to that widening the pace at which that gap is widening is likely to accelerate in the coming years. And so if you aggregate all of those ways of measuring certainly the quantitative side of the naval balance, things are starting to really radically tilt in China's way, in China's favor.
So one of the reasons why people have not been paying too much attention to the naval balance between Japan and China was that people are taking a look at the US Navy instead of Japanese Navy, right? And so the US Navy is a major component of the balance. So doesn't the balance look much more favorable for Japan when we count for the United States?
Sure. So yeah, absolutely. I think certainly if you add in even just, if you exclude the forces that are not forward deployed, the naval balance begin to shift again back in the Allies' favor, right? Whether it's in total tonnage, aggregate, aggregate tonnage, average tonnage per combatant, or in the number of VLS cells. Clearly, if you combine the U.S. Navy and the JMSDF, the combined naval power of the two countries again outweighs China by fairly significant margins. So certainly that's important. But I think the way that I look at this is slightly different, which is that from the U.S. policy makers' perspective, what I'm trying to encourage them to consider is that Japan's relative decline relative to China is in some ways a proxy for the corrosion of American power, right? Because it is the combined power of the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy that constitutes the totality of the balance. So Japan's relative decline and combined with America's relative decline to China, I think we need to be looking at this not merely as a bilateral naval balance, but to focus on the relationship between the balance between China and the United States, and then the local balance that's being impacted as well as China continues to rise. So China's relative rise and Japan's relative decline is in many ways a reflection of a relative decline of American staying power in the region as well. So that's one point. The second point is I think we might get to this conversation a little bit later about America's role in certain crises and contingencies. I mean, I think it's the degree to which the United States would be involved is contingent on many factors, right? We cannot assume that the United States will be there at all times, at any given time, and would be willing to use the full force of the capabilities available, across any conceivable contingency, right? I think it is conceivable, and again, I think this is worth sort of debating perhaps during the Q&A about the fact that there's a possibility that Japan may have to confront China alone, right? Japan cannot always take for granted that it's always the combined power of Japan and the U.S. as the best or the most reliable metric in understanding the naval balance. So that's why I, in some ways, purposefully focused on the local balance to draw attention to this phenomenon, right? That at some point, Japan too has to consider the, potential scenarios or situation in which it might have to fend off Chinese advances or Chinese opportunism at some point in the future.
So the U.S., the U.S. and Japan must stick together. We really should be working closely together. And
that's right.
So alliance management will be critical in this calculation. Right?
Absolutely, that's right.
So we talk about firepower, tonnage, numbers, but I mean, these are kind of traditional measures. Did you take a look at space, cyber, electromagnetic spectrum, which are emerging critical domains for the future warfare? If you did, how did it, matter in the calculation that you made?
Yeah, so so I think I didn't go into any depth into those sort of new domains of warfare, but I do think that those are critical points that you raised, which is that it's not just conventional military power; it is the enabling capabilities that these new domains provide. They are in some ways force multipliers for the conventional military power, and I think even in this area, what we find is that China has been in some ways ahead of the game by engaging in institutional reforms that began in 2015 that was designed to focus on these enabling domains. The creation of the strategic support force certainly was designed to focus on these enabling capabilities, and it is designed to underwrite and even more important sort of Chinese doctrinal approach to future conflict. Which is this idea that China needs to, in some ways, achieve superiority, or at least to be able to sort of impose its will by achieving information dominance. And the path to information dominance is to be able to have superior capabilities both in space and cyber and in the electromagnetic spectrum. So, China clearly recognizes the importance of information, of informationized warfare, and the importance of these domains, and that they would certainly play a role, say, in a conflict in the East China Sea or elsewhere. But I would also, though, caveat that by saying that I focused on the naval component, and I focused on the conventional military balance, because in my view, ultimately, you still need conventional military power to command the sea and to command the air in order for you to do things, in order for you to be able to impose your will on the adversary, right? Space, cyber, and the EMS might be able to enable you to do those things, but the ultimate arbiters are physical capabilities that allow you to impose your will on the adversary. And that means having command of the air and command of the sea. Those are foundational. And that's why I thought that it would be important to first have this foundational debate first before we moved on to sort of what these other areas might bring to the table.
Right. So that's what you did in chapter 2 and 3. You did kind of assessment of balance and different situations, and then in chapter 4, interestingly, you started to talk about the Chinese assessment of the naval balance, and in order to do that, you drew on Chinese language open sources. Apparently, you read and speak Chinese fluently. So could you tell us more about these sources and why you think these sources were important? And another question would be, do the Chinese political and military leaders read these things?
No, those are very good questions. So really the centerpiece of my report and the main analytical value that the report adds is by allowing the Chinese speak for themselves about the naval balance, about Japan's naval capabilities, and so forth, and to allow the Chinese to talk about whether or not this naval imbalance might give China more options, both in peacetime and in war. And I think what's important to note, is firstly is that these sources, while abundant, as I show in the report, there are a lot of Chinese talking about
how many materials you obtained.
Yeah, well, and it's quite abundant, but no one has tapped those resources. As far as I know, there hasn't been any serious attempt to assess how the Chinese view the balance, particularly from in terms of their view of Japan. Secondly, I think it's also important to note that when you compare that body of literature to the Chinese literature on the U.S. Navy, it's quite impressive that it's clear that the Chinese are firstly obsessed about the U.S., right? About U.S. military power, because certainly it's the most powerful military in the world, so it's no surprise they pay attention to it. But the country that is a close second is Japan. And it's, of course, not only because it's, Japan's a close neighbor, But of course, it's also because, Japan remains a leading military power, has a very advanced, modern, qualitatively superior military power. It has all the qualities, I think, that has instilled some degree of admiration, perhaps grudging admiration.
I know.
But Japan's military prowess actually attracts a lot of attention, second only to the United States, and this explains why there's so much of it. And so, it made me wonder even more, why is it that we haven't been paying attention to this, given the fact that the Chinese are telling us, publicly debating Japanese sea power. In terms of why I think these sources are important, I think I make a good faith effort in the report to at least to explain my sources and my methodology. And my philosophy is basically transparency, which is to say, I will use the sources and I will, to the extent that I can, identify both the background of the author, as well as their institutional background, as well as the importance or the institutional background of the publishers, as a way to at least get a sense of the authoritativeness of these writings. So I think transparency, in order to the best of my ability to identify their authoritativeness. And then, of course, the second part of this is that it just requires immersion in the literature, right? You just have to read a lot of it in order to, get a sense for whether, the thing that someone's saying is pure rubbish, or whether, this is something that's really important, right? And I think, you can make those kinds of judgments. Some of the sources are akin to sort of, Western academic journals. Some of them are equivalent to Western professional journals. Some of them, like the naval journals that I cite, some people have doubts or are skeptical about their utility. But as I point out, those naval journals are published by basically the Chinese naval industrial complex, right? They're very much closely connected to.
It sounds powerful, right?
Yeah,
Powerful, they got money.
That's right. They reflect the interest of the shipbuilding conglomerates. Of course, China now has the largest shipbuilding company in the world, and these journals reflect those views. And of course, the editors and the authors of those journals, whom I've met, are considered they're actually considered government units. So they have access. They have access to the engineers, to occasionally naval officers, and so forth. So, I would not write them off as, sort of insignificant sources. So I think if you can combine both these naval journals selectively, right, carefully selecting them, employing transparency to validate their authoritativeness, but also to look at official writings, which I also cite in the report, published by the Chinese Navy, for example. If you combine the two, I think you can get a pretty decent picture about the place of the debate. Now, you asked I think the most critical question is, okay, that may all be true, but does it really matter? Because if Chinese policymakers don't read them and doesn't really directly influence the party's policies or the Navy's policies, why would these sources matter? My sense is, again, in my reading of the literature, is that, we have to be careful to acknowledge that these sources do not reflect government or official policy or PLA policy, but that I think the leadership certainly allows for this very lively debate on these issues, so that the leadership can pick and choose from many of the arguments that are being advanced. And there's substantial evidence to suggest that many of these journal articles and the authors are actually making a case for specific bureaucratic actors in the Chinese government. And so it also gives you a sense for, like, what's the inter-service rivalry or some of the bureaucratic rivalries that are occurring within the Chinese political military system. So I think there's a lot of value in tapping into these sources, as long as you acknowledge their limits as well.
That makes sense. And I think it's a great idea to take a look at the perception, because, whatever the reality is, if they perceive the reality in one way, that matters, right? And so, in terms of, especially when In wartime, we'll, ultimately understand the real power balance by fighting. But in peacetime, in order to have, maintain the credibility of a deterrence, for example, we have to, basically control adversaries or manage adversaries' perception. So it's a great approach. I think I really appreciate it. And also, after the end of the Cold War, we realized how important the Soviet defense industry was. Sometimes they are more politically powerful than the Soviet general staff, right? It's amazing, but it can happen. So it's a good idea to take a look at the different actors and how they are kind of interacting with each other. So based on your research, what did you find out? What do Chinese analysts say about the underlying sources of the naval rivalry?
Yeah, so in one of the main chapters of the report, I try to break the various Chinese explanations for why the naval rivalry is likely to intensify into several distinct blocks. And I think you might think of those as structural sources. So, structural sources meaning the power imbalance, the geographic features of the alliance of Japan and how it relates to China's maritime ambitions, the condition of the U.S.-Japan alliance itself is also seen as a major source of the competition. And then fourthly, Japan's approach to regional and extra-regional security. So let me just go through those four structural factors first, to give you a sense of how the Chinese perceive the sources of the competition. So the first one is clearly the Chinese also understand that they're pulling ahead of Japan, right? Mm-hmm. And that what they're many Chinese analysts appear to kind of project onto Japan a growing sense of insecurity on the part of Japanese policymakers and also among the Japanese public. It's this idea that Japan was number one in Asia for over a century, right? So since the second half of the 19th century, certainly up through the middle to the late 20th century, Japan was undoubtedly the leading economic, military power, Japan boasting, to use Chinese terms, superior comprehensive national power. And that because of China's displacement of Japan, both economically and increasingly militarily, the Chinese themselves project this sense of security that Japan feels. And therefore, Japan would be more inclined to overreact to, Chinese advances in the maritime domain, and that it induces pressure on Japan to try to sort of keep China down, or at least to try to slow down China's momentum to prevent China from pulling even further away from Japan. So that's one view. Another view is, as you know, the Chinese are obsessed about the first island chain, right? The string of islands that run from Japan down through the Philippines. If you think about the second island chain, it also runs through Japan, through the Marianas to form the second island chain. So, Japan occupies a commanding and maybe even a dominant position along the northern half of the first island chain, and that the Chinese, of course, see the island chain, particularly Japan's position, as both a metaphorical, but in some ways a very physical barrier to China's maritime ambitions, particularly in the Western Pacific. And so the Chinese see Japan taking advantage of its geographical advantage, its commanding geographical position, particularly along the Southwest Island, to try to sort of block China's advances to the sea. So that, they believe, will intensify the competition. Right. The third, of course, is the U.S.-Japan alliance itself. Chinese analysts see the alliance as a strategic bloc that has both the will and the capability to frustrate China's ambitions. And here it's really interesting. They have these interesting conspiracy theories, which is that one, the United States is using the alliance as a platform to contain China, and that Japan itself is very instrumentally using the alliance in order for Japan to achieve its regional and global ambitions. And then finally, the fourth source of the competition is how they view Japan's actions and interactions in regional and extra-regional security. And they see Japan basically trying to form a coalition of like-minded maritime countries, mostly democracies, to try to surround and contain China. They see Japan's effort to supply, capacity building efforts with the Philippines, Vietnam, and so forth, really as an effort to tie China down in the South China Sea in order to divert China's attention and distract China from dealing with Senkaku's dispute and other disputes in the East China Sea. So it's kind of a diversionary strategy.
Right.
Some even talk about the fact that Japan's growing presence and activism in the Indian Ocean means that they have overlapping security and strategic interest in the Indian Ocean. But the problem is the Chinese see that as a fundamentally zero-sum game, which is that whoever has dominance in the Indian Ocean would give one geostrategic leverage over the other side. And so the fact that they have an interest in defending the sea lanes in the Indian Ocean actually, according to some Chinese, is actually a source of more intense competition. So again, if you just think along those four structural factors, it's not surprising, I think, that Chinese analysts hold a fairly sort of pessimistic view about the prospects for Sino-Japanese relations at sea.
Right. Oh, that's scary. And there's another interesting thing. The interesting feature of the Chinese discourse is the topic of Japan's national character. Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I actually found that part of my research to be fascinating and eye-opening, which is this idea among some Chinese analysts that Japan's hostility towards China is deeply ingrained in Japan's national DNA. And they attribute this hostility to historical factors like, Japan was never part of the Chinese tribute system, or that, Japan embraced the West and rejected, Asian values during the Meiji Restoration, and how Japanese naval officers embraced Western seapower theory, particularly Alfred Thayer Mahan's theory about an offensive strategy at sea. And then they go on to say that this offensive mindset in Japanese naval and maritime strategy is deeply embedded in the Japanese culture going back centuries. So I'm fond of quoting Senior Captain Feng Liang, who is a professor at the Naval Command College in Nanjing. And I quote him, and he says that Japan possesses, quote unquote, expansionist genes.
Yeah.
Very troubling language. And so it's kind of like Clash of Civilizations on steroids.
Right, yeah.
And so to me, I think that cultural argument further, I think, inclines Chinese analysts and strategists to view Japan with a great deal of suspicion. And I think this view, as you were saying about it's important to understand perceptions, I would argue that this view is actually fairly widely shared. I have certainly encountered it personally on my trips to China. A very ethno-nationalist based assessment of the other, and I think that's very troubling.
I know, right? Okay. So even after COVID-19, broke out, the Chinese ships continue to enter the Japanese territory waters around the Senkaku Islands. So we are talking about salami slicing tactics that China is using in order to create a situation. It's a kind of a fait accompli type of tactics. So they keep sending ships and create a situation where Chinese presence is almost like continuous, so that after 10, 20 years, they can say, well, we've been controlling these waters around the Senkaku Islands. So when we talk about China-Japan Navy naval competition, we talk about different scenarios, right? So the scenarios on the hypothetical Sino-Japanese naval conflict in the East China Sea have drawn a lot of attention. So could you tell us more about those scenarios?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the scenario, and they're not my scenarios, right? They're scenarios constructed by Chinese analysts about the potential for a conflict, a hypothetical scenario of a Sino-Japanese naval war in the East China Sea. And the scenarios actually share a couple of important characteristics that I think are worth talking about. The first is, and I really summarized two in the report, and some of the commonalities I think suggest a few things about perhaps Chinese strategy, but also perhaps their understanding of Japan and of the U.S.-Japan alliance. So first of all, the scenarios involve Chinese strikes against Japanese basing infrastructure that basically cripples Japanese air power. In particular, going after, for example, Naha Airport, that is the hub of Japanese air power in Okinawa, and that both scenarios hypothesize that Japan would very quickly lose control of the air, and that loss of command of the air or loss of air superiority then becomes the precondition for China to conduct follow-on operations against Japanese forces. One of the commonalities in the scenario that I find fascinating but also troubling is the U.S. non-intervention. And I think, I think that the assumptions they make about U.S. non-intervention are problematic at best. I have some real problems with their assumption, but nevertheless, I think it's really important to try to understand why the Chinese think that might be the case. But U.S. non-intervention is critical to Chinese operational success. And then, interestingly enough, in one of the scenarios, the Liaoning carrier battle group, plays a role. It doesn't play a direct warfighting role, but it plays a kind of a screening role. It kind of plays a diversionary role. I think the point of that is the Chinese assess the very presence of the carrier battle group would distract or tie down Japanese forces, because Japan would feel obligated at least to seek to track and monitor the carrier's movement, and that might then tie down Japanese resources, where then China can then attack from a different vector with another force. I thought that was a really interesting part of the scenario. And another important feature of both scenarios is that, again, in accord with Chinese naval doctrine in terms of Chinese naval writings on the future of naval warfare, it is warfare of the missile age, which of course means that the engagements are very quick, very lethal, very intense, and there are heavy casualties on both sides. So I think those 3 or 4 or 5 features of the scenarios were worth identifying, and I think worth using them as a basis for further debating what this means for Japan and for the Japan-U.S. alliance.
Right. Well, we can discount those scenarios as in which, especially those in which the U.S. decide not to intervene, right, as a kind of wishful thinking on the part of the Chinese leaders. But the thing is, they still have this wishful thinking, which might grow larger if left unaddressed. So we have to do something to address those potential challenges and prevent the situation where Chinese leaders misled to believe U.S. disengagement from really becoming kind of consensus in the Chinese mindset. So we have to think about what to do. So what are the implications of your study for Japan and for the U.S. Japan alliance going forward? And in this context, you raise an interesting point about Chinese leadership's fear of losing its fleet, and how the fear could be exploited by the U.S. and Japan. So could you talk about these issues?
Sure. So I think if you read the Chinese literature, I think one of the things that jumped out at me, including the way they structure the scenarios, is that I think they still genuinely believe that the Japan-U.S. alliance is what truly stands in the way of China's maritime ambitions. That as long as the alliance maintains its operational integrity and its strategic cohesion, I think that's the most powerful deterrent force out there that would make the Chinese leadership think twice about engaging in aggression or engaging in opportunism. And so I think the broad implication is that the Japan-U.S. alliance, as you've noted, still has an opportunity to ensure that the Chinese leadership does not misread Allied resolve and Allied capabilities. And whatever we can do to demonstrate in peacetime about the Allied integrity and the indivisibility of the alliance is sort of all to the good. So one of the implications for strategy is this idea that, we have to understand China's sort of psychological profile. We have to understand sort of China's deepest fears, what keeps Xi Jinping, up at night, what gets him to wake up in a cold sweat from a nightmare, right? So we need to understand their worst nightmares as a way to seek to shape their perceptions and to shape their behavior. And I guess my view is that it's clear that Xi Jinping has, since he came to power, but even before he came to power under Hu Jintao, they have sought to build up Chinese maritime power. And they spent a lot of political capital making the case to the Chinese public that, Seapower is a critical instrument for Chinese greatness, right? In order for China to achieve the so-called China dream, China needs to achieve great sea power, right? China needs to become a maritime power. It needs to have a world-class navy.
Right.
But of course, the leadership spent a lot of political capital, but they also spent a lot of money. Navies are very capital intensive. And so, my view is that China now, in some ways, has made itself vulnerable because the Chinese leadership finally, after years of buildup, has something valuable that it probably doesn't want to lose in a single afternoon. And so, my view is, what can the alliance do?
Good news, bad news, right?
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. So the Navy is a dual-edged sword, right? It confers prestige, it gives you all sorts of operational capabilities, but it's also something that you don't want to lose. And the Chinese certainly,
right?
Pardon?
Especially aircraft carriers, big capital ship with,
That's right.
Symbolizes national prestige and power, right? If it's
yes,
you are
right. Right. But it's also very visible, right? It's also very visible. It's also very vulnerable in some ways. And this is why the Chinese are targeting US carriers. So we could do the same in some ways. And, and I think it's not just that these things are valuable. I think that there's a historical component to this, which is that the Chinese are good students of history. They read their own history very carefully. They understand what happens when you lose a fleet. Right. And the Chinese themselves experienced that in the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, when the Chinese lost the Beiyang fleet, which contributed to its overall loss in the war. That loss sowed the seeds of social instability, right? The Boxer Rebellion that breaks out 5 years later is in part attributed to this humiliating loss against Japan. And of course, that sets the stage for the collapse of the Manchu dynasty. The Chinese also closely study the Russo-Japanese War, where again, Russia's loss of the Baltic Fleet against the Imperial Japanese Navy led to Russia's defeat, but it also sowed the seeds of social unrest, including naval mutinies, and it forced Tsar Nicholas II to engage in political reforms in order to stave off regime toppling forces. The Chinese certainly study very closely the Falklands War, right? Because it has fascinating parallels, right? A distant Western power coming across long distances in order to fight over an island feature off the coast of another country, right? So, and they saw that too, that when Argentina lost the war, it sowed the seeds of social forces that ultimately undid the power of the military junta and opened the way for, reopened the way for of a new political system premised on democratic governance. And so they see a close relationship between the loss of the Navy and regime instability, perhaps regime survival. And I think the alliance then needs to focus on that connection. What can we do to essentially understand that, whatever China holds dear, the alliance basically needs to hold hostage. What can the alliance do to credibly deliver on the threat of, for example, replaying the 1894, 1895 lopsided victory on the part of Japan? So if we can do things in peacetime to ensure that we can deliver on that promise, my view is that that might go very far to make the Chinese sow doubt in the minds of Chinese decision makers and thereby shore up deterrence.
Right, that's great. Okay, so that's what Dr. Toshi Yoshihara has to say, and that's what the report says. So let's open the floor for Q&A. By the way, there's no floor here, so unfortunately, so let's open the screen for Q&A. So those who are interested in asking questions or giving comments, please raise your hand electronically. So what you can do is to first press participants button at the bottom, and then you get the panel on your right, and there is a button at the bottom saying raise your hand. So you can, if you press that button, you can raise your hand. So let's go to John Bradford. Go ahead, John. You should unmute yourself. Okay, there is seems to be a problem. So let's go to the next person, who is Mr. Yoneda. Please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can.
Ah, okay, thank you, sir. I'm the Yoneda from the governmental official, and I have two questions for your lecture. And one is for the end state of this competition, and the second one is the value of the soft power. And the first question is, my question is, how do you see the end state of this competition? Because increasing military capability is easy by theoretical approach like realism, but it also causes the never-ending military expansion, and it will cause budgetary problem. 100 years ago, we agreed the naval military disarmament in Paris or Washington. And 30 years ago, it suddenly ended by Soviet collapsing. How do you see the next end? And the second one is, in this report, you mainly focusing on the problem in this region. But when we talk about Indian Ocean, the
Oops, sorry. Could you unmute yourself? I'm sorry, I pressed that.
Okay?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I think that the second one. The second question is about the value of soft power. And when we talk about the security environment around Japan, the hard power in Seapower is very important. But when we talk about the Indian Ocean, to get more influence in the region, the value of soft power is more important, I think. But as you know, the Japanese people are very tended to be influenced by the outer pressure, like your report. Of course, your report is very good. So my concern is, Americans say the hard power is very important in this period. So we have to concentrate the hard power only and underestimate the value of soft power. The such things happened in Japan. So how do you see the value of soft power in the present situation and future? Thank you.
So let me, for the sake of time, let me bundle 2 or 3 questions or people together. Okay, so let's go to Mr. Nakada Hidehiko. Please.
Yes, thank you for very much fruitful discussion. I am a DLD student, Hidehiko Nakada. I'm also working in the governmental department. And my question is regarding the Chinese expansion. And in order to counter the Chinese expansion, I think China wouldn't like to have a real war against the US. Therefore, I would say it is good for Japan to conduct a freedom of navigation operation with the United States around Senkaku, with the US carrier strike group escorting by the Japanese maritime fleet. It would be a good strategic communication, I think. So I would like to ask you, it would be effective or not?
All right, so let's go take another person. Professor Kenjimbo, would you like to go?
Well, thank you very much. I'm curious to know how Toshi-san found that China's major over and underestimation of the Japanese capability. And you mentioned about the China's psychological profile. That's fascinating, but sometimes that the human perception always presumes the opponents are always logical and rational, and as if we are effectively, deter and dissuade Chinese capability very rationally. But in the reality, that the democratic decision making always, has irrational components in our defense planning as well. So, did you find any kind of significant misplaced assessment and conclusion, especially on the Japanese, maritime self-defense capability? And if so, are there any policy implications that we can take advantage of their misperception?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Dr. Yoshihara, would you like to respond?
Sure. I think these questions flow very naturally, so I'll just go down in the order that the questions were asked. I think, what's the end state? I think there are certainly a couple of ways to think about the end state. I'm assuming you're asking about the Chinese perspective. So, certainly if you think about Xi Jinping's concept of the China dream, I think she's done a pretty good job laying out a roadmap for sort of what he hopes China would achieve, certainly by mid-century, if not earlier. And within the China dream, in my view, the external manifestations of the China dream is at a minimum the development of a multipolar international system in which China is at a minimum one of the poles, within the global order. That means, of course, by implication, Chinese dominance in the Western Pacific at a minimum. Of course, what that also necessarily means is a substantial reduction of American power and influence in the region in order for China to emerge as a pole. And so to the extent that the Chinese Navy and Chinese military power helps to achieve this gradual displacement of the United States, I think, clearly that is the risk of the balance shifting increasingly in China's favor. I think it's important to note that, I think China would prefer for it to achieve the dream without having to go to war, right? Which is to have, superior military capabilities such that, it deters U.S. and allied actions in ways that are harmful to China's interests. And so, if push came to shove, what the Chinese would like to see is that the United States would be too risk averse to take decisive action and opening strategic space for China to achieve whatever objectives it was seeking to achieve. So I think, to the extent that the Chinese Navy helps to achieve that, I think, this makes the Chinese Navy and the current naval imbalance a real concern. Now, I think there's another end state, of course, which is overextension, right? Which is the classic dilemma or the classic mistake or the classic problems that great powers face, which is that they jump too quickly ahead, or they overextend themselves either financially or geographically or militarily, or make too many commitments that their resources can't meet. And I think it is also entirely possible that the Chinese Navy will become part of this process of overextension. So think about it. All of the ships that have come into play, that have come online over the past 2 decades, particularly over the past decade, will be 20 to 30 years old, a decade and 2 decades from now. That means that there are all kinds of costs that comes with an aging fleet. as the US Navy can attest, operations and maintenance can become a very heavy burden as your fleet ages. The Chinese Navy will not escape that reality. And you know, what's important to note there too is that the aging fleet will come right at the time when various fiscal pressures will hit China, whether it's the economy that has already slowed and is slowing even more because of the COVID crisis, whether it's the demographic crisis that has all sorts of social economic distortions and pressures on China's financial health. You have all, the debt bomb that could potentially go off. Those are all converging in the next 10 to 15 years. So those types of fiscal pressures are happening just as the Navy is going to become very, very expensive to maintain and operate. So you can conceivably foresee the Navy actually contributing to China's overextension in these ways. So while China has a dream, it's great to have a dream, but there are all sorts of barriers to China's ability to, to achieve that dream. And I think that insight should also give the alliance some sense of the opportunities about perhaps what the alliance can do to maintain its competitiveness out into those years when China will run into all of these long-term structural problems. I take your point absolutely about, sure. No, sure, please, go ahead.
Just one thing, I mean, that's what happened to the Soviet Union because, people admire Admiral Gorshkov, right? But he, kind of encouraged the Soviet Union, his country, to spend a lot of money on the Navy, right? That was a part of that, and the cost became inhibitive toward the end of the Cold War. And some people actually criticize Admiral Gorshkov of overspending on money on defense.
That's right, absolutely. So again, that these shiny new toys that the Chinese have now could become potential vulnerabilities over the long term. Right. I think your point about soft power is well taken. And I think it's implied in my report that in fact, Chinese analysts see Japanese soft power as a real strength. This is why they're so concerned, and they have this sort of conspiracy theory that Japan is forming a maritime coalition of like-minded states to surround and close off China. And the one unifying thing that binds Japan to these maritime partners, they share the same values, right? Meaning it's a coalition of maritime democracies that China fears quite a bit. And so they acknowledge that Japan holds substantial reservoirs of soft power that could be part of the competition. But I would also flip that around and say the Chinese are also acutely aware of the power of soft power. If you think about China's geo-economic and political warfare and influence operations, whether it's in Southeast Asia and South Pacific or in the Indian Ocean littorals, they are also trying to make inroads through non-military means. This suggests that this is a comprehensive competition, that Japan and the United States can't just focus on hard power, military power to compete. We have to compete in all of these domains in order to compete effectively. So I don't disagree with you. And in fact, in some ways, that might be considered to be one of our sort of comparative or competitive advantages, that we do have high quality allies, partners, and friends that do share many values, particularly a maritime outlook that depends on the open seas. That is in some ways fundamentally at odds with China's much more closed mentality, particularly when it comes to the near seas. I think these types of sort of ideational differences, if you will, should be emphasized as a kind of the glue that can bring these maritime partners together. The point about what the U.S. Japan can do in the face of Chinese expansion, I've always thought that whatever we can do to demonstrate the indivisibility of the alliance is all to the good. So to the extent that Japanese and American forces can operate seamlessly, to operate as a genuine combined coalition, and to do it in ways such that China cannot drive wedges within the alliance, cannot find seams that they can seek to exploit. So the more that we can make the Chinese think that, in any given situation, American forces are either going to be involved or going to be nearby, such that Chinese use of force would almost automatically target US vessels or US personnel or US assets. That would basically virtually guarantee American involvement. And again, the prospect of American involvement, in my view, I think still remains a major intervening factor in the way Chinese decision makers think about cost-benefit analysis, about the benefits and risks of using aggression either against Japan or against the alliance. So there's been a lot of talk about a standing joint task force, right? A permanent joint task force, to deal with operations in East China Sea. I would welcome that. The more that there's integration within the alliance, the more that it'll be very difficult for China to seek to isolate Japan. And finally, to Ken's point, absolutely, I absolutely agree that one of the insights that should come from an analysis of the Chinese literature is to understand their blind spots, their misjudgments, and just sort of outright wrong assessments about both Japan and about the U.S.-Japan alliance. And of course, one of the things that I discerned, especially in the scenarios, is this very sort of simplistic depiction of the relationship between the alliance partners. That, the danger there is that they convince themselves that the alliance is a purely transactional relationship, right? Where the United States gets something out of Japan, Japan gets something out of the alliance for its own purposes. And then they overlook the shared norms, the shared institutional values, the shared responsibilities, that have been implemented over decades, and that, they're very sort of, I would say, a caricature of the U.S.-Japan alliance might lead them, might talk themselves into thinking that they could take actions that would seek to isolate Japan and the United States. So whatever we can do to disabuse Chinese decision makers of this caricature of the alliance, for example, would be, one way to in this case, to correct Chinese misjudgments. And I think, again, we can do that through, very visible demonstrations of alliance integrity and, cohesion. And so there are ways to convince the Chinese that, to get them to think twice about their judgments. I also think that there is a danger that they actually talk themselves into thinking that they're actually that superior. I think a lot of the assumptions that they make in the scenarios are very problematic, that somehow taking out, bases along the Southwest Islands would essentially completely cripple Japan's ability to defend the air and the seas. Some of that might be true, but I also sense really an overestimation of the PLA's ability to pull off that kind of an operation. And that, again, that might convince the Chinese then to be more inclined to roll the iron dice than they otherwise should. And so again, to the extent that we can demonstrate the resilience of Japan's defensive posture, that, Japan won't shatter like a piece of glass, that, once the Chinese decide to conduct a first strike, that they ought to expect, massive pushback on the part of Japan and on the part of the United States. I think that's another really important point. The third point is, the scenarios end, right? The scenarios end with, China takes the Senkakus, yay, China wins, right? The problem is, of course, one of the most difficult challenges of any war planning, of any state engaging war, is war termination. In my view, China taking the Senkakus and perhaps temporarily knocking out Japan is only the first step, right? Yeah. It could be at that point that the United States decides to intervene, right? Because the United States does not want to see, Japan getting knocked out of a conflict, or Japan becoming neutralized as a result of an operational loss. It could be that, Japan has a lot more cards to play, right? After that initial encounter. So have the Chinese thought through that? Do the Chinese think that once Plan A is executed and they achieve that constitutes a win? The more that we can convince the Chinese that war termination is going to be an incredibly difficult problem for them, that if they start a fight, they're not likely the ones who's going to decide who ends that fight. And the more that we can convince them that it will, the course of the conflict will actually be determined by Japan and the United States, I think that will go far to, to convince them and to shape their deterrence calculus and also to shape their behavior.
Thank you very much. So we have, we see 2 hands up. So let's go to Mr. Kawachi. Would you like to pose your question?
Yes, good morning, Doctor. My name is Yusuke Kawachi, a staff officer working at the ground staff office. And thank you very much for your inspiring report and this seminar. And I had 2 questions. The first is a question of how to fill the widening gap between Japanese and Chinese navies, which Professor Michista has already touched upon. In this regard, I found quite interesting that you are somewhat critical of the maritime self-defense force current architecture. I think you write Japanese naval power resides primarily in a relatively small number of capital ships. So given this assessment, as far as I understand, simply beefing up maritime self-defense force of the current architecture would not be the best solution to fill the gap. And I'm wondering, what do you think would be a wise option for future capabilities to meet this challenge and fill the gap and bring about the cold sweat of the Mr. Xi Jinping? And second question is that I think your report is of huge practical value for practitioners in Tokyo and Washington, D.C., rather than being a purely academic work. So I'm curious if there is any sponsor on the US government side for this report, and is there any intention behind this report of activate future discussions between Tokyo and Washington, D.C. and setting some agenda or shaping the direction of discussions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those questions.
Let's take one more question from
Sure.
Professor Furuya, and let me unmute you. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Toshi, for your presentation. My question is regarding the scenario included in your paper. It is very surprising to me because the trigger of the conflict was the use of force by JCG, Japan Coast Guard cutters, and which I believe very unlikely. What do you think this scenario is that very common to Chinese scholars, if not your own scenario? I'd like to have your impression on this point. Thank you very much.
Right. So actually, I have one question. So let me ask that. So when we talk about targeting Chinese fleet, there are, kind of broadly speaking, 2 types of potential target groups. One is surface ships. The other is submarines. And in the peacetime, I think it's a good idea for us to talk about, kind of targeting surface ships, because that would really make Chinese life difficult. I mean, it's it has a symbolic value, easy to understand for any thinkers and people, planners to, think about potential consequences of going war against Japan, right? But at the same time, in wartime, if you start targeting the surface ships, which carries a tremendous political and symbolic value, that might make it difficult for the Chinese leaders to agree to the termination of war, because they would have lost face in a big way. So it might be better for us to kind of target in wartime submarines, because by destroying submarines, we can, kind of convey a message, our strong message to the people who know, right? Planners, top leaders, without really necessarily having or forcing the Chinese top political leaders lose their face in front of their people. So that's my question. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So this question about, so, what should the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force do? I mean, I think, assuming that, Japan doesn't enjoy more defense resources, and that's probably not an unrealistic expectation, then, it is going to be about changing the portfolio of existing force structure and capabilities, trading off certain capabilities in exchange for new or other kinds of capabilities. So it's likely going to require essentially a redistribution of resources within, not only within the maritime service, but I think across all of the services. So, I think that, increasingly, as the Chinese analysts note, is that, increasingly large signature capabilities like Japan's helicopter carriers are, I think, increasingly losing their utility in an increasingly inhospitable environment that will be filled with Chinese A2AD systems. And so we have to, I think, consider options that first of all, to make these assets less vulnerable, but also to shift assets in ways that focuses on perhaps smaller combatants, but that also pack a punch, going in the unmanned direction, so having unmanned systems, also focusing on something that the US Navy, of course, has been working on, which is this idea of, maritime distributed operations, creating essentially a real targeting challenge or headache for the Chinese side to multiply the number of targets and the number of problems that the PLA would have to deal with. I also think that this isn't, as I just mentioned, an exclusively maritime service problem. This is going to be a problem for the entire joint force. And as Japan goes into this idea of multi-domain or cross-domain operations, I think increasingly it's about jointness. It's about the collaboration of the services in defense of the key maritime approaches, particularly along the Southwest Islands. And that means I think there's a role for the ground self-defense force to play in terms of their maritime strike function. I think certainly Japanese air power would play an absolutely critical role. And so having a distributed capability that gives the Japanese defense posture more resilience, I think, would certainly be one way in which Japan can make those choices within their current existing resource constraints. As for what was the intent behind the report? This was my project. This was my ongoing research interest. It was based on my own individual scholarship. CSBA, of course, enjoys funding from a variety of sources, whether it's government sources, foundation sources, like any other think tank that you would encounter in Washington. But I think the important point here to make is, this was an idea. This was a research project that I had always wanted to do, even before I had joined CSBA. And I simply had the opportunity as a researcher at CSBA to finally pursue this research project. So this was something that's been sort of in some ways bothering me for quite a few years about why people haven't been talking about this issue. And it's just been, I've just been very fortunate to have had this opportunity to convey this message. As for the scenario, yes, I agree. It's highly unlikely that the Japan Coast Guard would be the one that would use force. Now, as I made clear in the report, it's not clear, right? The scenario starts with Japan taking the first shot. It's not clear why Japan takes the first shot. And there are multiple, there are many, I guess, sort of plausible explanations for why that's the case. It may be that because of China's various attritional tactics that they've employed, the salami slicing tactics that Nichi just mentioned, the pressure of the Chinese Coast Guard, it's possible that it was instigated by the Chinese themselves, meaning that the Chinese took certain actions that forced Japan to react in such a way that then gave China the excuse then to counterattack. And there's plenty of historical evidence to suggest that that is in fact China's MO. And that's why I chose the scenario, because it's plausible that China could position itself in such a way and force Japan to act in certain ways so that China would have the diplomatic and moral leverage to say, it's the Japanese, they started it. Since they started it, we have to now finish the game on our own terms. And I say that there's a historical precedent, of course, is the 1974 Paracel Sea battle that I documented in another study, where it was a brief naval battle between China and South Vietnam. And that was a very interesting dynamic, because South Vietnam by 1974 was essentially an abandoned ally. The United States had fully withdrawn from South Vietnam in 1973. The Chinese also knew that the Americans were very interested in normalizing relations with China, having opened doors with China in 1972. And so they calculated that South Vietnam was probably very isolated. The United States was probably not going to intervene very strongly, and their gamble turned out to be right. How did the conflict happen? Well, they created a situation that became so unbearable that the South Vietnamese Navy had to dispatch its forces to, secure its interest in the in the Paracels, and that it was, in fact, South Vietnam maneuvered into a position where it had to take action that gave China the excuse, essentially, to open the doors of war to take the rest of the Paracels into their possession. So, in my view, it's plausible that China would seek to maneuver Japan into that situation. And again, as we all know, China's Coast Guard and the Chinese maritime militia is only growing in power. They will have many more options in the future as mass increases, as they have the presence and the capabilities to assert their will. At one day, it could be possible one day that China asserts permanent administration of the waters around the Senkakus, right? They decide to deploy Coast Guards on a permanent basis around the waters of the Senkakus. Well, what would Japan do next, right? It would be then up to Japan to decide whether it wanted to escalate or not. And if Japan decided to escalate, then that would give China the excuse to use force. And so, again, while the tactical circumstances might not be realistic, I think the logic behind that is entirely plausible. Finally, to Michi's point, yeah, I mean, I think whether we want to target surface ships or submarines will probably depend on context, what the Chinese are using the submarines for, and what are they using the surface ships for. I think my only caveat would be, we have to make sure that we don't sort of talk ourselves into inaction, which is that, if we sank these things, then it would force it would back the Chinese into a corner, and then they might, lash out. If you take that argument too far, then, you might actually end up convincing yourself not to do anything at all.
Right. And so convincing the Chinese that they might be going to war with us.
Well, I mean,
we say, well, we would just stand still and, do nothing.
Well, yeah, I guess my view about that, about that line of argument is simply that we have to be careful not to take it so far that we're so afraid of China escalating that we end up not taking actions at all in response to Chinese aggression. But I think it's reasonable, to make the argument that once we decide to use force, that, we might want to discuss, like, how many ships you want to sink, what types of ships you want to sink, right? So, if you think about our judgment as to how much damage was sufficient for us to say we've achieved victory with Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. If you might recall, it was partly about the number of tanks that we were able to plink in the campaign. What's the percentage of the force that we would have to attrit in order for us to say, operationally speaking, this adversary force has been neutralized. So, but I think your point is a good one, and it's an important one, because measuring the effects of your operations are going to be very difficult, right? Like sinking a particular number of ships, how is that actually directly influencing the cost and benefit calculus of the leadership? That's one of the most difficult things to read, right? How many submarines will we have to sink to the bottom of the ocean to convince the Chinese that the pain is too much? I mean, that's going to be one of probably the most difficult debates that are likely to take place when a conflict breaks out. And I think, to your point, we better be thinking about this now, right? Like, we need to have, fairly straight in our minds, what are the parameters by which we're going to judge what types of tactical actions are likely
Everybody,
to produce
please
those
keep coming back,
strategic
and we'll
effects.
get
Is
together
it,
and talk about
30% of the fleet, 50%
issues
of the fleet,
mutual
30% of the
concern.
submarine force, or 60% of the submarine force? I think we should at least have this discussion about sort of like what is enough, what do we think is enough to impose sufficient pain for China to say enough, or we're going all in.
Right. All right, with that, thank you so much for your insights. I know it's 10:30 p.m. in Washington, D.C. So you are going to bed now, right?
Yes.
So sweet dreams.
Yes, I think it's going to be hard to go to bed with all the adrenaline running through me right now after this intensive conversation. So
take a pill or glass of beer before you do. Right. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Yoshihara. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, hope you keep coming back, and we'll keep in touch. And thank you everybody. Please keep coming back, and we'll get together and talk about more about the issues of our mutual concern. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Peter. Good day.